The sun hung merciless over Copper Creek, Arizona territory, late summer of 1872. Heat waves danced off the red dirt, like spirits fleeing hell itself. The air tasted of dust, desperation, and the kind of dreams that die hard under an unforgiving sky. Around the makeshift auction platform, nothing more than weathered boards laid across two freight wagons, a crowd of men gathered like vultures circling prey. Their faces were leather tough, sun-beaten, carved by wind and want. Cowboys with silver spurs that hadn't seen polish in months. Miners with dirt under their fingernails and gold fever in their eyes. Drifters who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hunger in their bellies. The kind of men the frontier both forged and forgot. A portly man in a sweat-stained vest and a tin star that had lost its shine years ago stepped onto the platform. Sheriff Dockery, they called him, though his authority extended only as far as his shotgun could reach. He mopped his brow with a dirty handkerchief and surveyed the crowd with the weary eyes of a man who'd seen too much and cared too little. "All right, boys," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the desert heat like a rusty blade. "Last lot of the day. Came in on the morning stage from Tucson. Name's unknown. Face is, well, you'll see why that don't matter none." A few men chuckled, but it was the kind of laughter that held no joy, only the bitter edge of men who'd learned to find humor in misery. She's got skills, they say. Can cook, clean, mend, claims she's got letters, can read and cipher. Starting bid is $3. Who's fool enough or desperate enough to take a chance on damaged goods? From the crowd came jeers and catcalls. "What's wrong with her face?" someone shouted. "She got the pox," called another. "Maybe she's cursed," a third voice added, and this time the laughter was nervous, superstitious. On the platform stood a figure that might have been carved from shadow and silence. She wore a simple brown dress, patched but clean, that had seen better days and kinder hands. Her feet were bare, dusty from the long journey, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope. But it was what covered her head that drew every eye and stilled every tongue. A burlap hood, coarse and brown, pulled down over her face and tied tight at the throat. Only her breathing betrayed her humanity. Quick, shallow, controlled but barely. Her hands, visible at her sides, trembled like leaves in a storm wind, clenching and unclenching in a rhythm that spoke of fear held just barely in check. "She ain't said a word since Tucson," Sheriff Dockery continued. "Won't show her face, won't give her name. Bills of sale say she's bound for service, legal and proper. Payment of debts, they call it. Who'll start the bidding?" Silence stretched like a taut rope. Men shuffled their feet, spat into the dust, studied the ground as if it held secrets worth knowing. No one wanted to be the first to bid on a mystery wrapped in burlap and bound in rope. Then, like the parting of the Red Sea, the crowd shifted. From the back, a man stepped forward. Tall he was, broad-shouldered beneath a leather vest dark with sweat and soot. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms corded with muscle and scarred by honest work. His hair was black as coal dust, his jaw square and stubbled. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, gray as storm clouds, steady as mountain stone. He moved with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that haste led to mistakes, and mistakes in his line of work could mean lost fingers or worse. The crowd parted before him like wheat before a scythe, and when he stopped at the foot of the platform, his voice rang out clear and certain. $3! The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sheriff Dockery blinked, as if he couldn't believe someone had actually bid. A few men in the crowd laughed nervously, but most just stared. "You sure about that, Ezra?" the sheriff asked. "You ain't even seen what you're buying." The man called Ezra tilted his head slightly, studying the hooded figure on the platform. When he spoke, his voice was low, but carried to every ear. "I ain't buying a face," he said quietly. "I'm buying a person." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. A few men nodded grudgingly. Others shook their heads and began to drift away, already losing interest in a transaction that had suddenly turned serious. "Name?" Sheriff Dockery asked, pulling out a ledger and a stub of pencil. Ezra Kane, blacksmith, Copper Creek trade, ironwork, horseshoes, wagon repairs, tools, got a shop on Main Street. The sheriff scribbled in his book, sweat making the pages stick to his fingers. All right then. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I hereby pronounce you legally wed in the eyes of God and the law. Congratulations, I guess. He turned to the hooded woman. You're married now, miss. Law says you got to give your name for the record. For a long moment, nothing. The woman stood statue still, the burlap hood moving only with her breathing. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity overcoming their earlier indifference. Then, so softly that men had to strain to hear, a voice emerged from beneath the hood. It was like the whisper of wind through dry grass, barely more than breath made sound. Rose Whitmore. Ezra's eyes widened slightly, just for an instant. Then his expression hardened again, like iron cooling in the forge. He stared at the hooded figure, and something passed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the shadow of a memory he'd tried to bury. Without another word, he stepped onto the platform and gently took the woman's arm. Not roughly, not possessively, but with the careful touch of a man who knew the weight of responsibility. Come on, he said quietly. Let's go home. They walked through the dusty streets of Copper Creek as the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains. Rose, if that was truly her name, said nothing, her head still covered, her steps careful and measured. Ezra led the way, his heavy boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. The town watched them pass with the keen interest of people who had little entertainment beyond gossip and speculation. Women peered from behind curtains. Men paused in their whittling and card games to stare. Children poked their heads around corners, eyes wide with curiosity and the peculiar cruelty that comes naturally to the young. But Ezra paid them no mind. He kept his eyes forward, his pace steady, leading his new bride toward the shop and home he'd built with his own 2 hands. The blacksmith shop sat at the end of Main Street, where the town began to surrender to the desert. It was a solid building, built of adobe and timber, with a wide door that stood open to catch any breeze that might dare to venture into the forge's heat. Beside it, connected by a covered walkway, stood a modest house, 2 rooms and a kitchen, simple but well built, with a stone chimney and windows that caught the evening light. Ezra opened the door to the house and stepped aside. You choose where you want to be, he said quietly. No one's going to make choices for you anymore. Rose stepped inside slowly, cautiously, like a wild animal entering a trap. The interior was sparse but clean, a table and chairs, a cooking stove, shelves lined with books and tools. Everything in its place, everything purposeful. The home of a man who lived alone but took care of what was his. She moved to the far corner of the room and sank to the floor, back against the wall, knees drawn up. The burlap hood still covered her face, and she made no move to remove it. Ezra watched her for a moment, then nodded, as if he'd expected nothing different. He moved to the stove and began building a fire, his movements economical and practiced. Soon the smell of coffee began to fill the room, rich and strong, along with the aroma of beans and salt pork sizzling in a cast-iron pan. Haven't had company for supper in, well, longer than I care to count, he said as he worked, not looking at her directly. Used to cook for 2 anyway, out of habit. Always seemed wasteful, throwing out the extra. Rose said nothing, but her breathing had steadied, and she was no longer trembling. My wife, my first wife, she always said a man who couldn't cook was a man who couldn't take care of himself, Ezra continued, stirring the beans with a wooden spoon. Reckon she was right about that. She was right about most things. When the food was ready, he filled 2 plates and set one on the floor within her reach. Then he sat at the table with his own plate, eating slowly, methodically, giving her space and time. After several minutes, Rose reached for the plate. Her movements were careful, controlled, and she managed to eat without removing the hood, lifting it just enough to bring the spoon to her mouth. What happened to her? The words came so quietly that Ezra almost didn't hear them. He paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Fever took her. 3 years ago. Came on fast, was gone before the doctor could do anything. He set down his spoon and stared at his plate. Been eating alone ever since. I'm sorry, Rose whispered. So am I. He looked up at her, though he could see nothing of her face beneath the hood. What about you? How'd you end up on that auction block? Silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Finally, Rose spoke, her voice barely audible. That's a story for another day. If there is another day. Ezra nodded. There'll be other days. As many as you need. The desert sunrise came gentle but insistent, painting the adobe walls of the house in shades of gold and amber. Through the single window of the main room, light crept across the wooden floor like fingers reaching for warmth. Rose sat in the same corner where she'd spent the night, knees still drawn up, the burlap hood still covering her face. She'd slept little, if at all. Every creak of the house, every sigh of wind through the eaves, every distant sound from the waking town had made her tense like a deer sensing wolves. But Ezra had been true to his word. He'd asked nothing of her, demanded nothing, expected nothing. He'd simply spread a blanket on the floor for her and taken his own rest on a narrow cot in the adjoining room. Now he moved about the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of morning ritual, building up the fire, setting coffee to boil, slicing bread and salt pork. The sounds were domestic, peaceful, the kind that spoke of routine and safety. Morning, he said without turning around. Sleep at all? Some, she lied. He poured coffee into 2 cups and set one on the floor beside her, just as he'd done with supper the night before. Then he sat at the table and sipped from his own cup, staring out the window toward his forge. Got work today, he said. Mrs. Henderson's got a wagon wheel needs fixing, and the preacher's horse threw a shoe. You're welcome to stay here, or you can come watch if you've a mind to. Up to you. Rose said nothing, but she reached for the coffee cup and lifted her hood just enough to drink. The liquid was strong and hot, and it cut through the desert chill that still clung to the morning air. Why? The word came out before she could stop it. Ezra looked at her, his gray eyes patient and steady. Why what? Why didn't you? Last night you could have. She trailed off, unable to voice the words that hung between them like smoke. Could have what? His voice was gentle but firm. Could have forced myself on a woman who was scared half to death. Could have taken what I wanted because some paper said I had the right. She was quiet for a long moment. Most men would have. Most men ain't me. He finished his coffee and stood, moving toward the door. I got no use for what ain't given freely. Never have. He paused at the threshold and turned back to her. Name's really Rose? The question hung in the air like dust motes dancing in sunlight. She lifted her head slightly, though her face remained hidden. Yes, she whispered. Rose Whitmore. He nodded once, as if that settled something important. Well then, Rose Whitmore Kane. Welcome home. And then he was gone, his boots crunching on the gravel path that led to his forge. Rose sat alone in the morning light, holding the warm coffee cup in both hands, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to believe that she might truly be safe. The sound of hammer on anvil rang out across the desert like a church bell, calling the faithful to worship. Ezra worked with the focused intensity of a man who'd found his calling in fire and iron. Each strike was precise, purposeful, part of a rhythm older than civilization itself. Rose found herself drawn to the doorway of the house, watching him work from the safety of shadow. He'd stripped to his undershirt, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving like poetry written in flesh and sweat. His hands, large, scarred, calloused, handled the red-hot iron with a delicacy that seemed impossible, shaping it with the patience of an artist and the strength of a giant. She'd known a blacksmith once, long ago and far away. But that man had been different, brutal where Ezra was gentle, crude where he was careful. Watching Ezra work was like watching a different species entirely, a man who understood that creation required both power and restraint. "Quite a sight, ain't he?" Rose spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A woman stood behind her, middle-aged, gray-haired, wearing a simple blue dress and a knowing smile. She was small and rounded, with kind eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. "Didn't mean to startle you, honey," the woman said. "I'm Martha Henderson. My husband runs the general store down the street." Rose pressed herself back against the doorframe, pulling the hood tighter around her face. I'm Rose Kane, I expect," Martha finished for her. "News travels fast in a town this size. Ezra's new bride, married yesterday at the auction." The words carried no judgment, only curiosity and perhaps a touch of sympathy. Martha stepped closer, but not too close, seeming to sense Rose's fear. "I brought you something," she said, pulling a small bundle from beneath her arm. "Figured you could use a few things to make you feel more at home." She set the bundle on the ground between them and backed away a step. Rose stared at it as if it might be a snake coiled to strike. "What is it?" "Just some fabric and notions. A needle and thread. Figured a woman might want to make her own clothes, choose her own colors." Martha's voice was gentle, understanding. "There's a looking glass in there, too. Small one, but it catches the light nice." Rose's hands trembled as she reached for the bundle. "Why would you?" "Because every woman deserves to feel like a woman," Martha said simply. "And because Ezra Kane is a good man who's been alone too long. If you're going to be his wife, you might as well look the part." She turned to go, then paused. "There's a women's circle meets at the church on Sundays after service. Just us ladies talking and sewing and such. You'd be welcome when you're ready." And then she was gone, leaving Rose alone with the bundle in a confusion of emotions she couldn't quite name. Kindness from a stranger was something she'd almost forgotten existed. That evening, as the desert heat began its slow retreat before the coming night, Rose sat in her corner, with Martha's gift spread before her. The fabric was nothing fancy, simple cotton in soft colors, blue and green and cream, but it was clean and new, and it smelled of the general store rather than fear and sweat and desperation. The mirror was small, as Martha had said, barely larger than a man's palm. Its silver surface was slightly clouded with age, but it reflected true. Rose held it in her hands for a long time, before finally lifting her hood and looking at herself. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Her face was thinner than she remembered, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had seen too much sun and not enough good food. Her hair, once her pride, hung lank and lifeless around her shoulders. But it was the mark on her left cheek that drew her attention, a scar in the shape of a crescent moon, raised and white against her tanned skin. She traced it with one finger, remembering the day it had been carved into her flesh. The pain, the blood, the laughter of the man who'd held the knife. "Figured I'd mark you so every man who looks at you knows what you are," he'd said. "A whore, a liar, a thief." But looking at herself now, in the soft light of Ezra's home, she saw something different. The scar was still there, would always be there, but it no longer seemed to define her. She was thin, yes, and marked, but she was alive. She was safe. She was, for the first time in years, free to choose her own path. Behind her, she heard Ezra's footsteps on the gravel, returning from his evening chores. Quickly, she pulled the hood back over her head and tucked the mirror away. But her fingers lingered on the soft fabric Martha had brought, and in her mind, she began to imagine what it might feel like to wear something beautiful again. "Rose?" Ezra's voice came from the doorway, gentle and questioning. "I'm here," she whispered, Mrs. Henderson stopped by the forge today. Said she'd brought you something. Rose nodded, though he couldn't see the gesture beneath her hood. She's very kind. That she is. Been a good friend to me since Sarah passed. He moved into the room, began his evening routine of banking the fire and preparing supper. She lost her first husband to the war, knows what it's like to start over. If anyone can help you settle in here, it'd be Martha. He paused in his work, looking at her across the room. You don't have to tell me your story until you're ready, he said. But when you are ready, I'll listen. No matter what it is, no matter how bad you think it might be. I've heard worse, and I've done worse. Nothing you could tell me would change the fact that you're my wife now, and I take care of what's mine. Rose felt tears prick at her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself in months. Not tears of sadness or fear, but something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Thank you, she whispered. No need for thanks between husband and wife, he said. That's what marriage is supposed to be. Two people taking care of each other, no matter what comes. As he prepared their evening meal, Rose sat in her corner and let his words wash over her like cool water in the desert. For the first time since she'd been dragged from her old life and sold like cattle, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end in tragedy. Maybe it could end in something like love. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm as steady as hammer on anvil. Rose remained in her corner, hood covering her face, speaking little but watching everything. She watched Ezra work his iron with the focused intensity of a man who understood his craft in his bones. She watched the townspeople come and go, some curious about the blacksmith's mysterious bride, others respectfully ignoring her presence. She watched the desert change from day to night, the heat giving way to coolness, the harsh light softening to gentle shadow. And slowly, carefully, she began to trust. It started small, removing the hood while Ezra was at the forge, working by herself in the privacy of the house, using Martha's fabric to mend her old dress, then later to create a new one. Looking at herself in the small mirror for longer periods, growing accustomed to her own reflection. Ezra never pushed, never demanded. He simply existed in the same space, offering safety through his presence and kindness through his actions. He cooked for two, set out 2 plates, and never made her feel like she was stealing food that belonged to someone else. He spoke to her as if her opinions mattered, asked her thoughts on small domestic matters, treated her like a partner rather than property. On a Thursday morning, as autumn began to paint the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold, Rose made a decision that surprised them both. When Ezra returned from his morning chores, he found her standing in the kitchen, hood pushed back, face uncovered for the first time since their wedding day. She stood frozen, vulnerable, waiting for his reaction. The scar on her cheek seemed to pulse in the morning light, a crescent moon of raised flesh that told a story she wasn't ready to voice. Her hair fell in waves around her shoulders, brown as rich earth, and shot through with gold where the sun touched it. Her eyes were the color of sage after rain, wide and watchful and holding secrets. Ezra stopped in the doorway, his hand still on the latch. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, husband and wife seeing each other clearly for the first time. "Well," he said finally, his voice soft and wondering, "ain't you pretty as a sunset?" Rose's hand flew to her cheek, covering the scar. "You don't have to—" "I don't say things I don't mean," Ezra interrupted gently. "And I mean that. You're beautiful, Rose. Scars and all." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Most people find scars ugly. Most people don't know the difference between a mark of shame and a badge of survival. He stepped into the room, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "That scar tells me you've been through hell and came out the other side. In my book, that makes you stronger than most." He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her. "You want to tell me how you got it?" Rose took the cup with trembling hands, wrapped her fingers around its warmth, I was married before, to a man named David Whitmore. He was not a kind husband. Ezra's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. He hurt you. He hurt me in ways that left scars you can see and scars you can't. She moved to the window, stared out at the desert stretching toward the horizon. I tried to leave him once. He caught me packing my things. Her finger traced the scar on her cheek. He said if I was going to act like a whore and run off, he'd mark me like one. Used his hunting knife. Said every man who looked at me would know what I was. Ezra's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained steady. What happened to him? He got drunk one night and fell down the stairs. Broke his neck. Rose's voice was flat, emotionless. The sheriff said it was an accident, but David's brother. He said I pushed him. Said I murdered my husband. She turned from the window to face Ezra, her chin lifted defiantly despite the tears on her cheeks. Maybe I did. Maybe I wanted him dead so badly that God just made it happen. Does that make you sorry you married me? Ezra set down his coffee cup and crossed the room to her. He stopped just arm's length away, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give her space to retreat if she needed it. Rose, he said, his voice firm and sure, I've killed men. In the war, with my bare hands and with weapons. I've watched good men die and bad men live, and I've learned that sometimes the only justice in this world is the kind we make ourselves. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention, and gently took her hands in his. If your husband is dead, whether by accident or by your hand, I can't say I'm sorry for it. Any man who would mark a woman like that deserves whatever comes to him. Rose stared at him in wonder. You're not afraid of me? Afraid of you? Ezra's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Lady, you're about as dangerous as a kicked kitten. Might scratch if cornered, but mostly you just want somewhere safe to rest. Despite everything, Rose found herself almost smiling in return. A very pretty kicked kitten, Ezra amended, with claws. For the first time since she'd known him, Rose laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it was real. And in that moment, something shifted between them, a wall coming down, a door opening, a bridge being built across the distance that had kept them strangers living in the same house. So what happens now? Rose asked. Now we see what we can build together, Ezra said simply. If you want to build something, if you're ready to try. Rose looked around the small kitchen, at the life Ezra had created through his own hard work and determination. She thought about the fabric Martha had given her, the kindness of strangers, the possibility of belonging somewhere again. I think, she said slowly, I might be ready to try. 2 months into autumn, when the mornings carried the first hint of winter chill and the cottonwoods along Copper Creek had turned to gold, Trouble rode into town on a dust-covered horse. The man who dismounted outside the Silver Dollar Saloon was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory stillness that made honest folks cross the street to avoid him. He wore black from hat to boots, and his coat hung open to show the ivory-handled pistol at his hip. His name was Marcus Whitmore, and he'd come looking for his brother's widow. Rose saw him first from the window of the house, and the coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers to shatter on the floor. The sound brought Ezra running from the forge, his face darkening when he saw her expression. "What is it?" he demanded. "He's here," she whispered. "David's brother. He's found me." Ezra moved to the window, peered out at the street. The stranger was talking to Sheriff Dockery now, showing him something, probably a wanted poster with Rose's face on it. Even from this distance, Ezra could see the family resemblance, the same cruel mouth, the same cold eyes that had probably watched David carve that scar into his wife's cheek. "Stay here," Ezra said, reaching for his gun belt. "Lock the door, and don't open it for anyone but me." "Ezra, no!" Rose caught his arm. "You don't understand what he's capable of. He's not like David. He's smart, and he's patient, and he won't give up until he gets what he wants." "And what does he want?" Rose's voice was barely a whisper. He wants me dead. Or worse. He wants me to pay for David's death. In his mind, I'm a murderer who needs to be brought to justice. He won't stop until he sees me hang. Ezra gently freed his arm from her grip, his gray eyes hard as steel. Well, he's going to have to go through me first. And I don't plan on making that easy for him. He strapped on his gun belt with practiced efficiency, checked his weapon, then turned back to Rose. Whatever happens, you remember this. You're my wife now. That means something in this territory. He can't just take you without due process, and I won't let him railroad you through some kangaroo court. Promise me you won't do anything foolish, Rose begged. I can't lose you too. The words slipped out before she could stop them, revealing feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. Ezra's expression softened, and he cupped her scarred cheek in his calloused palm. I promise, he said, but you promise me something too. Don't you give up. Don't you let him make you believe you deserve whatever he's got planned. You're worth fighting for, Rose Kane. Don't you forget that. He kissed her forehead gently, then strode toward the door. Rose watched him go with her heart in her throat, knowing that her past had finally caught up with her, and that the peace she'd found in Copper Creek was about to be shattered like that coffee cup on the floor. Outside, Marcus Whitmore had finished his conversation with the sheriff and was making his way down Main Street, his eyes taking in every detail of the small town. When he saw Ezra approaching, he stopped and smiled, a cold, calculating expression that never reached his eyes. You must be Kane, he said, his voice cultured and smooth. I'm Marcus Whitmore, from back east. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I belong to no one, Ezra replied evenly, and my wife belongs to no one but herself. You got business here, state it plain. Marcus's smile widened. Your wife is wanted for the murder of my brother David. I've come to take her back to face justice. Justice? Ezra's voice was dangerously quiet. Or revenge. Perhaps they're the same thing in this case. Marcus reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. I have a warrant here, signed by a judge in Colorado Territory. Your wife is to be remanded into my custody for transport back to Denver, where she'll stand trial for murder. Ezra took the paper, scanned it quickly. The legal language was dense and formal, but the meaning was clear enough. According to the document, Rose Elizabeth Whitmore was wanted for the murder of her husband and was to be arrested and returned to Colorado for trial. This warrant's 3 years old, Ezra observed. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Marcus replied smoothly. I've been searching for her all this time. Imagine my surprise when I heard that a scarred woman with a covered face had been sold at auction in Arizona Territory. It took some time to confirm it was her, but here we are. Ezra folded the warrant and handed it back. You want my wife? You'll have to go through the proper channels. File your papers with our sheriff. Let him decide if this warrant has jurisdiction here. Oh, I've already spoken with Sheriff Dockery. He's agreed to cooperate fully. Marcus tucked the warrant back into his coat. I'll be collecting my sister-in-law first thing tomorrow morning. I do hope she's prepared for the journey. He tipped his hat mockingly and turned to walk away, but Ezra's voice stopped him. Whitmore. Marcus turned back, eyebrows raised. Your brother was a man who marked women with knives and called it justice. If you're cut from the same cloth, you might want to reconsider tangling with me. The smile faded from Marcus's face, replaced by something much colder and more dangerous. Are you threatening me, Mr. Kane? I'm stating a fact. My wife is under my protection now. Anyone who wants to hurt her will have to answer to me first. How romantic, Marcus drawled. A blacksmith playing knight-errant for a murderess. I wonder if you'll still feel so noble when you know the whole truth about what she did to poor David. I know enough, Ezra said flatly. I know she was married to a man who carved up her face for sport. I know she survived something that would have broken most people. And I know she's mine to protect now. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. Well then, I suppose we'll see how far protection can extend when the law comes calling. Good day, Mr. Kane. Give my regards to Rose. He strolled away as if he hadn't a care in the world, leaving Ezra standing in the dusty street with a growing sense of dread in his gut. Whatever legal maneuvering Marcus had done, whatever story he'd told Sheriff Dockery, it was clear that he held the stronger hand. By tomorrow, Rose could be gone, dragged back to Colorado to face a trial that would likely end with her neck in a noose, unless Ezra found a way to stop it. That evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains, Rose and Ezra sat at their kitchen table like condemned prisoners awaiting execution. The warrant lay between them, its official seals and legal language, spelling out Rose's doom in terms that brooked no argument. "Maybe I should go with him," Rose said quietly. "Maybe if I face this thing head-on, tell the truth about what David was like." "They'll hang you," Ezra said bluntly. "You said yourself that Marcus has influence, money, connections. You think a frontier jury is going to believe a scarred woman over a respectable man from back east?" Rose touched her cheek unconsciously. "Then what choice do I have?" "We could run," Ezra said. "Load up supplies, take the horses, and head for Mexico. Once we're across the border, that warrant won't mean anything. And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders?" Rose shook her head. "That's no way to live, Ezra. And besides, you've got a life here, a business. I won't ask you to give that up for me." "You're not asking," Ezra said firmly. "I'm offering." "Hell, Rose, I'm more than offering. I'm insisting. We took vows, remember? For better or worse, till death do us part. This qualifies as worse, I reckon." Rose felt tears gather in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You would really do that? Give up everything you've built here?" "Everything I built here was just me marking time until I had something worth building for," Ezra said. "You want to know the truth? I was half dead before you came along, going through the motions, existing but not living. You gave me a reason to hope again." He reached across the table and took her hands in his. "I love you, Rose. Not because you need saving, not out of pity or obligation, but because you're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known. If running is what it takes to keep you safe, then we run." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Rose stared at him in wonder, seeing not just the kind man who'd offered her shelter, but the man who'd become her partner, her protector, her heart. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I thought I could ever love anyone again." But even as they spoke of escape, both knew it might already be too late. Outside, the town slept uneasily, and somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Whitmore was probably planning how best to spring his trap. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Rose had spent the night alternately packing supplies for their escape and staring out the window at the empty street, waiting for Marcus to appear with his warrant and his cold smile. Ezra had been busy too, sharpening weapons, loading ammunition, preparing for whatever fight might come. They were just finishing breakfast when the knock came at the door. Not the polite tap of a neighbor or the urgent hammering of emergency, but the measured, authoritative rap of law enforcement. Rose's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with trembling hands. "Mrs. Kane," came Sheriff Dockery's voice through the door. "I need you to come with me, ma'am." Official business. Ezra was already on his feet, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "What's the nature of this business, Sheriff?" "Got a warrant here for Rose Elizabeth Whitmore Kane. She's wanted back in Colorado on murder charges." "Let me see that warrant," Ezra called back. "Bring it to the window where I can read it proper." There was a pause, then the sound of boots moving around to the front window. Sheriff Dockery appeared, holding up the legal document, but he wasn't alone. Marcus Whitmore stood behind him, along with two other men Rose didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with the look of hired guns about them. "This ain't a negotiation, Kane," Dockery called out. "This here's a legal warrant, properly executed. Your wife's got to come with us." "Over my dead body," Ezra replied, his voice carrying clearly through the glass. Marcus stepped forward, his cultured voice honey-smooth despite the threat in his words. That can be arranged, Blacksmith. But it would be so much easier if you just send her out. No need for unnecessary violence. Rose moved to stand beside her husband, her spine straight despite the fear coursing through her veins. I won't hide behind you anymore, Ezra. If they want me, they can take me face to face. Rose, no. It's all right, she said, touching his arm gently. I'm tired of running. Tired of being afraid. If this is where it ends, then at least it ends with me standing on my own 2 feet. She moved toward the door, but Ezra caught her hand. Wait, he said. There's something I need to tell you first. He pulled her close, spoke in a whisper, meant for her ears alone. Martha Henderson. She's not just a shopkeeper's wife. Her first husband was a judge back in Kansas before the war. She knows law better than most lawyers. I sent word to her last night. As if summoned by his words, a new voice joined the conversation outside. Sheriff Dockery! Sheriff, wait just a minute. Through the window they could see Martha Henderson hurrying up the street, her gray hair flying behind her and a leather satchel clutched in her hands. She was followed by what looked like half the town, other shopkeepers, their wives, the preacher, even some of the cowboys who frequented the saloons. What's this about, Mrs. Henderson? Dockery asked, clearly uncomfortable with the growing crowd. It's about legal procedure, Sheriff, which you seem to have forgotten in your haste to accommodate this gentleman. Martha's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd spent years as a judge's wife, listening to legal arguments and courtroom procedure. She opened her satchel and pulled out a thick book. According to territorial law, any warrant from another jurisdiction must be reviewed by a local magistrate before it can be executed. Did you do that, Sheriff? Dockery shifted uncomfortably. Well, the warrant looked official enough. Looking official and being legally enforceable are 2 different things, Martha continued crisply. Furthermore, Mrs. Kane has the right to legal representation and a hearing before any extradition can take place. Marcus Whitmore's face had gone red with anger. This is ridiculous. That woman is a wanted murderer. That woman, Martha replied sharply, is an American citizen entitled to due process under the law, something you seem to have forgotten in your zeal for what you call justice. The crowd murmured agreement, and Rose felt a flutter of hope in her chest. These people, strangers who barely knew her, were standing up for her rights, demanding that the law be followed properly. Now, Martha continued, I suggest you gentlemen return to town and file the proper papers with Judge Morrison over in Tucson. If this warrant is legitimate and properly executed, Mrs. Kane will have her day in court, but it will be done according to law, not according to your personal schedule. Sheriff Dockery looked relieved to have an excuse to back down. She's right, Whitmore. I should have checked with the judge first. We'll have to— The hell with that, Marcus snarled, his cultured facade cracking to reveal the violent man beneath. I've waited 3 years to see that murdering bitch pay for what she did to my brother. His hand went to his gun, and suddenly the morning exploded into chaos. The first shot came from one of Marcus's hired men, aimed not at Rose or Ezra, but at Martha Henderson, who dove behind the water trough as splinters flew from the post beside her head. The townspeople scattered, screaming, but several of the men, shopkeepers and cowboys alike, drew their own weapons and began returning fire. Inside the house, Ezra kicked over the heavy kitchen table and pulled Rose down behind it, just as bullets began shattering the windows. Stay down, he ordered, then rose up long enough to put 2 quick shots through the front window. The battle was fierce but brief. Marcus and his men were outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just Ezra, but half the population of Copper Creek. When the smoke cleared, one of the hired guns was dead and the other was badly wounded. Marcus himself crouched behind the sheriff's horse, blood streaming from a graze on his temple, his weapon empty. Give it up, Whitmore, Ezra called out. You're done. This isn't over, Marcus screamed back. I'll see her hang if it's the last thing I do. Maybe, said a new voice, calm and authoritative, but it won't be today. Everyone turned to see a tall man in a black coat and federal marshal's badge walking up the street, his own weapon drawn but pointed safely at the ground. Behind him rode a small troop of cavalry soldiers, their uniforms dusty from hard travel. "Marshal William Hayes, Territorial Authority," the man announced. "I believe you gentlemen have been having some legal difficulties." Marcus struggled to his feet, his face desperate. "Marshal, thank God. That woman is wanted for murder. I have a warrant." "You have a forged document," the marshal interrupted calmly. "We've been tracking you for 6 months, Whitmore. Seems you've been using fake warrants to hunt down women across 3 territories. Your brother's widow isn't the first one you've tried to drag back for your own private version of justice." The blood drained from Marcus's face. That's not... She killed him. According to the real investigation, the one conducted by actual law enforcement officers, David Whitmore died in a drunken fall down a flight of stairs. His wife wasn't even in the house at the time. She was at a church social with 30 witnesses. Marshal Hayes holstered his weapon and nodded to his soldiers. "Marcus Whitmore, you're under arrest for forgery, impersonating a law officer, attempted kidnapping, and now attempted murder. Gentlemen, take him away." As the soldiers moved in to arrest Marcus, he made one last desperate lunge toward the house where Rose stood watching from the broken window. But Sheriff Dockery, perhaps trying to redeem himself for his earlier mistake, stepped into his path and laid him out with a single punch. "Should have checked that warrant like Martha told me to," Dockery muttered, rubbing his knuckles. "Could have saved everyone a lot of trouble." The cleanup took most of the morning. Windows needed boarding, bullet holes needed patching, and the wounded man needed tending by the town's doctor. Rose found herself in the strange position of being the center of attention, not as a curiosity or a victim, but as a member of the community who'd been wronged and needed support. Martha Henderson took charge of organizing the women to help repair the damage to the house. The menfolk dealt with the bodies and the prisoners, while the children were shooed away to safety until the excitement died down. "Well," Martha said, sweeping broken glass into a dustpan, "that's the most excitement we've had in Copper Creek since the Apache troubles 5 years back." Rose knelt beside her, picking up the larger pieces of window glass. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I never meant to bring trouble to your town." "Honey," Martha replied firmly, "you didn't bring trouble. That snake of a brother-in-law brought trouble. You just happened to be what he was hunting." She paused in her sweeping to look directly at Rose. "Besides, sometimes a community needs to stand together against something wrong. Makes us remember who we are and what we stand for." Later that afternoon, when the repairs were done and the excitement had died down, Rose found herself alone with Ezra for the first time since the shooting. They sat on their front porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains, both of them still processing what had happened. "It's really over?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's really over," Ezra confirmed. "The marshal made it clear. There never was a valid warrant. Marcus was just using his brother's death as an excuse to hunt you down. Without him and his fake documents, you're free and clear." Rose leaned back in her chair, feeling as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "I can barely believe it. After all this time, all the running and hiding and fear." "You don't have to believe it yet," Ezra said gently. "But you can start learning to believe it. One day at a time." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the townspeople go about their evening routines. Children played in the dusty street. Women hung laundry on lines strung between houses. Men gathered outside the saloon to discuss the day's events and embellish them with each telling. "Ezra," Rose said eventually, "what you said this morning about loving me, did you mean it?" He turned to look at her, his gray eyes warm and steady. "I meant every word." "Did you? When you said you loved me too?" Rose felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. "I meant it. I never thought I could feel that way again after David, but you You made me remember what kindness looked like, what safety felt like, what it meant to be cared for instead of owned. Ezra reached over and took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. So what happens now? We've got no more secrets between us, no more threats hanging over our heads. Just you and me and whatever we want to build together. Rose considered the question, looking out at the town that had become her home, the community that had stood up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. For the first time in years, the future stretched ahead of her like an open road, instead of a trap waiting to spring. I want to build a real marriage, she said finally. Not just two people sharing a house out of necessity, but a true partnership. I want to be your wife in every sense of the word, if you'll have me. Ezra's smile was slow and warm as sunrise. Rose Kane, he said, I thought you'd never ask. 1 year later, on an autumn morning when the desert air carried just the hint of coolness that promised relief from the summer's heat, Rose Kane stood in front of her mirror. Not the small clouded glass Martha had given her, but a proper vanity mirror that Ezra had ordered special from back east. She wore a dress of her own making, cut from fabric she'd chosen herself, a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was pinned up in a style she'd learned from Martha and the other women of the town, and around her throat hung a simple silver locket that had been Ezra's wedding gift to her on their first anniversary. The scar was still there, of course. It would always be there, a crescent moon of raised flesh that told the story of her past. But looking at herself now, Rose saw something different. The fear was gone from her eyes. The hunched, defensive posture had straightened into something proud and strong. She looked like a woman who'd found her place in the world and meant to keep it. You about ready in there? Ezra called from the kitchen. Preacher gets cranky if we're late for Sunday service. Almost, Rose called back, making a final adjustment to her hair. Just wanted to look respectable for church. You could wear a flour sack and still be the prettiest woman in 3 territories, Ezra replied, making her smile. Their relationship had deepened and strengthened over the months since Marcus's arrest. They'd learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs, each other's dreams. Rose had discovered that Ezra possessed not just strength and kindness, but intelligence and humor, and a gentle way with words when the mood struck him. Ezra had discovered that beneath Rose's caution and fear lay a woman of remarkable courage and resilience, someone who'd survived the unthinkable and still found ways to hope. They'd built more than a marriage. They'd built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. And if it had taken them longer than most couples to fully share a bed and all the intimacies that came with it, well, that had made those moments all the more precious when they finally arrived. As Rose emerged from the bedroom, Ezra looked up from where he sat at the kitchen table reading a week-old newspaper from Tucson. His face lit up with the same appreciation and wonder she'd seen there for months now, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real and she was his. Beautiful, he said simply, rising to offer her his arm. Shall we go shock the good people of Copper Creek with how respectable we look? Rose laughed, taking his arm. They're probably still talking about the time you threw Marcus Whitmore's hired gun through the saloon window. That was self-defense, Ezra protested with mock dignity. He shot first. After you told him his mother was a coyote and his father was questionable. Well, it was true. They walked through the town arm in arm, nodding to neighbors and friends. Rose still caught the occasional curious glance. The scar ensured that, but they were glances of recognition now, not speculation. She was Mrs. Kane, the blacksmith's wife, a member of the community in good standing. The mysterious woman with the covered face was ancient history. At the church, they found their usual pew near the back. Martha Henderson waved from across the aisle, where she sat with her husband and a visiting niece from back east. The preacher, an earnest young man named Joshua, who'd only recently arrived from a seminary in Ohio, was already looking restless to begin his sermon. As the service began, Rose found herself thinking not about the words being spoken from the pulpit, but about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, She'd been a frightened woman on an auction block, her face hidden, her future uncertain. Today she sat beside a man who loved her, surrounded by people who'd accepted her, in a place she could truly call home. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been nights when the nightmares came, when the old fears rose up like ghosts to haunt her sleep. There had been days when the scar seemed to throb with remembered pain, when she wondered if she'd ever truly be free of David Whitmore's cruelty. But Ezra had been there through all of it, patient and steady as stone, never pushing but always available when she needed him. And gradually, slowly, she'd learned to trust, not just him but herself. She'd learned that she was stronger than her fears, braver than her doubts, worthy of the love and respect she'd found in Copper Creek. After the service, they lingered in the churchyard to visit with friends and neighbors. Martha's niece, a young woman named Catherine, who'd recently lost her own husband to consumption, seemed particularly interested in hearing Rose's story. "I don't know how you did it," Catherine said quietly, "how you found the courage to start over after losing everything." Rose considered the question carefully. "I think sometimes we're stronger than we know," she said finally. "And sometimes we need other people to show us that strength before we can see it ourselves." She glanced at Ezra, who was deep in conversation with the preacher about some repair work the church needed. The right person can make all the difference. Someone who sees you for who you are, not what's been done to you. Catherine followed her gaze, then looked back at Rose with something like hope in her eyes. Do you think I could find that kind of person?" "I think," Rose said gently, "that when you're ready to be found, the right person will find you. It might not happen the way you expect, or when you expect it, but it will happen." Later that evening, as they walked home through the cooling desert air, Ezra asked her about the conversation with Catherine. "She's lost," Rose said simply, "the way I was lost when you first found me. Afraid of the future, afraid of trusting again, afraid of hoping. Think she'll find her way?" "I hope so. Everyone deserves a chance at happiness." They'd reached their house now, the windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Ezra paused at the gate, looking at the home they'd built together, not just the physical structure, but the life within its walls. "You know what I was thinking during church today?" he said. "What's that?" "I was thinking about that day at the auction. How I almost didn't bid. How I almost walked away because $3 seemed like too much to risk on a stranger." Rose turned to face him, curious. "What made you change your mind?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Your hands," he said finally. "Even with that hood covering your face, even with the fear and the silence, I could see your hands. And they were graceful, gentle, the hands of someone who'd known kindness once, even if they'd forgotten what it felt like." He took those hands now in his own, studying them in the lamplight that spilled from their windows. They were no longer soft. Months of domestic work had calloused them, and she bore a small scar on her thumb from a kitchen knife. But they were steady now, sure of themselves and their place in the world. "I figured," Ezra continued, "that anyone with hands like that deserved a chance at finding kindness again. Turned out I was right, but not in the way I expected." "What do you mean?" Ezra smiled, that slow, warm expression she'd come to love. "I thought I was saving you, Rose. Turns out you were saving me." Inside their house, they moved through their evening routine with the comfortable efficiency of long partnership. Rose banked the fire while Ezra secured the doors and windows. They prepared for bed in the quiet companionship of two people who'd learned to share not just space, but dreams. As Rose brushed her hair at the vanity, she caught Ezra watching her in the mirror. There was something in his expression, a contentment so deep it seemed to glow from within, that made her heart swell with answering happiness. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The future," he said, "our future. What we might build together in the years to come." Rose set down her brush and turned to face him. "And what do you see in that future, Mr. Kane?" "Children, maybe. A bigger house. More land. You teaching other women to read and write. I've seen how you are with Catherine and some of the younger wives. You've got a gift for helping people find their strength." He paused, then added with a grin, "And me getting fat and gray and spoiled by the best cook in Arizona Territory." Rose laughed, moving to sit beside him on the edge of their bed. "That's a fine future you're planning, sir. Think we can make it happen?" "I think," Ezra said, pulling her close, "that we can make anything happen, as long as we're together." Outside their window, the desert stretched away under a canopy of stars, vast and wild and full of possibilities. Somewhere out there, other lost souls were probably searching for home, for safety, for the kind of love that could transform fear into hope and strangers into family. But inside the small adobe house at the end of Main Street, two people who'd found each other against all odds, settled into sleep with the quiet confidence of those who'd learned that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst, and that sometimes the greatest love stories began with the smallest acts of faith. Rose Elizabeth Kane closed her eyes and dreamed of tomorrow, not with the dread that had haunted her sleep for so many years, but with the eager anticipation of a woman who'd finally learned to believe in happy endings. And in the bed beside her, Ezra Kane smiled in his sleep and dreamed of a future bright with promise, secure in the knowledge that he'd found not just a wife, but a true partner for whatever adventures life might bring. The desert wind whispered through the eaves of their house, carrying with it the sense of sage and possibility, and in the morning they would wake to another day of the life they'd chosen to build together. One hammer stroke, one gentle word, one small act of love at a time. The sound of children's laughter rang out across the expanded yard behind the Kane house, where a proper garden now flourished under Rose's careful tending. Two little ones, a boy of 4 with his father's gray eyes and a girl of 2 with her mother's golden hair, chased chickens around the coop while their parents watched from the shade of a ramada Ezra had built the previous summer. Rose sat in a rocking chair Ezra had crafted with his own hands, nursing their newest addition. A baby boy barely 3 months old who'd arrived with the spring rains and his father's stubborn chin. She wore a dress of soft yellow cotton, and her hair was braided with wildflowers their daughter had picked that morning. The scar was still there, would always be there, but it had faded with time and happiness until it seemed less like a brand of shame and more like a badge of survival, which, Rose had come to understand, was exactly what it had always been. "Catherine's coming up the road," Ezra observed, nodding toward the dust cloud approaching their house. "Looks like she's got company." Rose shaded her eyes with her free hand, smiling when she recognized the second horse and rider. "That's her young man from the sawmill. Thomas, I think his name is." Catherine had indeed found her way, just as Rose had predicted. It had taken 2 years of gentle encouragement and the supportive community of Copper Creek's women, but she'd eventually opened her heart to love again. The courtship had been slow and careful. Both parties had been wounded by life, but it had been built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. "Think he'll propose soon?" Ezra asked, settling into the chair beside his wife. "I think he already has," Rose replied with a knowing smile. "Look at how she's glowing. And see that new ribbon in her hair? A woman doesn't wear her finest for just any Sunday afternoon visit." Sure enough, when Catherine and Thomas reached the house, the first words out of Catherine's mouth were, "Rose! Ezra! We have news!" The afternoon was spent in celebration, sharing coffee and Rose's famous apple cake, while the children played and the adults discussed wedding plans. "It would be a simple ceremony," Catherine explained. "Just family and close friends in the church, followed by a reception at the town hall. Nothing fancy, but heartfelt and true." "You know," Catherine said as the sun began to set and she and Thomas prepared to leave, "I never thanked you properly for what you told me that day at church. about being ready to be found. Rose adjusted the sleeping baby in her arms, thinking back to that conversation years earlier. You found your own way, Catherine. I just reminded you that there was a way to find. Still, Catherine insisted, you gave me hope when I needed it most. You showed me that happiness was possible again, even after losing everything. After their guests departed, Rose and Ezra sat on their front porch as evening painted the desert in shades of gold and purple. The children were inside, supposedly settling down for the night, but more likely plotting some new mischief. The baby slept peacefully in Rose's arms, tiny fists curled against his mother's breast. Penny for your thoughts, Ezra said, reaching over to stroke the baby's downy head. I was thinking about that auction, Rose replied, about how terrified I was, how certain I was that my life was over. How I never could have imagined this. She gestured with her free hand at the scene around them. The comfortable house, the thriving garden, the sounds of their children's voices drifting through the windows. All of this because you took a chance on a woman with a covered face. Best $3 I ever spent, Ezra said with a grin, though I seem to remember the price being a bit higher by the time you factored in food, clothing, medical care, house repairs. Rose laughed, playfully swatting at him with her free hand. Are you saying I've been expensive to maintain, Mr. Kane? I'm saying, Ezra replied, growing more serious, that you've been worth every penny and then some. You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible. Not just children and a home, but purpose. You made me remember what it meant to be truly alive. As if summoned by their parents' conversation, their eldest son appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from play, and his gray eyes bright with mischief. Mama, he said, Emily won't go to sleep. She says the chickens told her secrets, and she has to tell them to someone before morning, or they'll forget. Rose and Ezra exchanged amused glances. Their daughter had inherited not just her mother's golden hair, but also a vivid imagination and a stubborn streak that could rival any mule in the territory. Well, Rose said, standing carefully so as not to wake the baby, I suppose we'd better go hear these chicken secrets before they're lost forever. As they moved toward the house, their son slipping his small hand into his father's much larger one, Rose paused to look back at the desert that stretched away toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, under that same canopy of stars, other people were probably struggling with their own demons, their own fears, their own desperate need for hope. She said a silent prayer that they would find what they were looking for, not necessarily in the dramatic way she had, but in whatever form grace chose to take in their lives. Love, she had learned, came in many disguises. Sometimes it wore the face of a stranger at an auction. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a community willing to stand up for justice. Sometimes it was simply the quiet courage to hope for something better. Rose? Ezra called from the doorway. Emily's getting impatient. Apparently the chickens have very important news about buried treasure in the garden. Coming, she called back, following her family into the warmth and light of home. Behind her, the desert wind whispered through the sage and mesquite, carrying with it the eternal promise of new beginnings. And in the small adobe house at the end of Main Street, the Kane family settled into another evening of the life they'd chosen to build together. One day, one laugh, one small act of love at a time. In Copper Creek, Arizona territory, where the sun rose each morning on endless possibilities and love could bloom in the most unlikely places, Rose Elizabeth Kane tucked her children into bed and kissed her husband goodnight, secure in the knowledge that some stories, the best stories, never really end. They just keep growing, one generation at a time, like wildflowers blooming in the desert after rain,